Welcome to part 7 of our cognition unit. Today what we're going to be talking about is assessing intelligence. So in our last video, we were looking at, what is intelligence? What does that really mean, or how can we define it? What we're going to be looking at now is, once we have this definition, how do we assess it? How do we compare, or how do we tell who is intelligent, or maybe more intelligent or less intelligent than each other? So there's a lot of things we want to talk about. So first, let's just talk about what an intelligence test is in general. So when we're talking about an intelligence test, it's a method of assessing an individual's mental aptitudes and comparing them to those of others. Now, generally speaking, the way we're going to do this is using a numerical score. It's pretty hard to compare intelligence without using, at least like across different people, without using some sort of score to do so. Otherwise, it's really arbitrary of what the difference is. So it's a way of looking at intelligence scores and then being able to compare to other people, right? Normally it's going to spit out some sort of number at the end, some sort of score at the end that we can then compare to other people. And the way it does this is going to look very differently depending on what you're using. But in the end, you're usually going to get some sort of score at the end. Now, there are two different types of tests that we could use. We have what are called achievement tests and aptitude tests. And each of them is looking at something a little bit different. So an achievement test is a test designed to assess what a person learned. So an achievement test is like the test you get at the end of the year, or all of our unit tests in psychology. Those are all achievement tests, where we go through the information, you learn it, and then at the end you get a test. And what I'm really looking at is, how much did you learn? I don't give you the test before we've covered anything, because I haven't taught it to you yet, right? It's not telling me anything. So an achievement test is like the kind of test you receive in school normally, where again it's looking at what have you learned from whatever you experienced. Now we also have what are called aptitude tests. So an aptitude test is designed to predict a person's future performance, their ability to do something, or their capacity to learn, if we're talking about intelligence tests in general. So the best example probably of an aptitude test is like the ACT. What it's doing is it's trying to test your ability, predict your ability to perform in college. That's the point of an ACT, which is why an ACT is a standardized thing that it doesn't really matter necessarily what you did in school. They're going to give you the same test, because what they're looking for is not what have you learned, but what are you able to do. And then obviously their idea is applying that and saying, okay, well, if you score really, really high on the ACT, that probably says that you have a pretty good chance of performing really well in college. If you score really, really low, it means you probably have a lower chance of doing really well in college. Now, ACT obviously isn't like a perfect, it's actually relatively accurate, but it's not a perfect thing, right? There's obviously other things like we talked about in the first video, like grit and social circumstances and all these other kind of things that affect your ability to achieve. But it does give us a pretty good idea. If you go and you get like a 34 on your ACT, the reality is you're probably going to do well in college, even if, right, maybe you don't work as hard or you're not as willing to kind of put in time as other people, just because you're so naturally gifted. It's going to be easier. Where if you score really, really low on your ACT, it doesn't mean it's impossible to get through school, but it's going to be much more challenging, right? The other things that you have to have, the other attributes that you have to be so much greater than that other person, right? And you guys can think about that. I'm sure you guys kind of can understand that. You've seen that in school. You've seen that in other students, or in athletics or music or art or whatever, where some people just are more naturally gifted, so it's easier. Doesn't mean that both people can't be very successful. It's just a difference in how they get there. So again, difference: achievement test is about what you have learned. Aptitude test is about your ability to perform, right? Your capacity to do well. So let's look at some different types of intelligence tests. So we're going to kind of talk about some of the most important ones. Now, this first one is one that is not used at all anymore, but it's our first ever true, at least attempt at an intelligence test. And it came from Sir Francis Galton. And what he was trying to do, and this is in France, he was trying to basically measure intelligence in some way. Now, at the time, there was a lot of different ideas about what that meant, what intelligence actually was. So, for example, they believed that intelligence was inherited and that it wasn't influenced by the environment. So, if you had intelligent parents, you would then be intelligent, and if you had, an intelligent husband or wife, your kids would then also be intelligent, and kind of on and on and on. Now, the way that he tested intelligence had a whole bunch of different things. I'm just going to give you a few examples. But there was, I think there were like 13 or 14 different little tests that they did. But he tested things like reaction time, sensory acuity, muscular power, and body proportions. So they literally measured the proportions of your body. Now, as you can kind of tell, and you can probably imagine from those different tests, they didn't really have much of anything to do with intelligence, right? And his test in reality failed. People that were successful didn't necessarily outscore people who weren't. And again, intelligence in a lot of ways is about trying to measure success, right? Or our ability to be successful. So it probably makes pretty good sense to you that, having a proportional body or having a lot of muscular power doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your ability to succeed, for most people at least, in the world. Same thing with reaction time or sensory acuity, right? How well you see or how well you hear doesn't necessarily have anything to do with that ability. So at the end of the day, his test failed, and they kind of moved on from there. The next really important intelligence test that we'll see came from Alfred Benjamin, who created the Benjamin Intelligence Scale. Now, one thing that's really important is Benet's scale really isn't supposed to be an intelligence test. It ends up being one, but it's not really what it's made for. So what happened was, this is kind of early on when public schooling was becoming kind of newer, and what happened was the government basically asked Benjamin to create a way to identify children who would need extra help before school started. So what he basically did was created a test that you could give to children, so this is like before first grade, like really young children, and they could take the test and we would see a score, and what that would tell us is whether the child was ahead of, behind, or right on kind of track for their age. And this becomes the first modern day intelligence test, the first one that is kind of still really impactful and influential today, although I don't believe it's still used, at least not the same way it used to be. Now, what his test gave us was what was called a mental age. That was what it spit out at the end. What that basically is a measure of the intelligence test that is measured against your chronological age. So what we want to do is just compare you to your peers. So the idea is, if I have this test and I give it to, 10,000 first graders, 10,000 second graders, third graders, fourth graders, on and on and on and on, right? And I can go lower and higher as well. And then I can look at, okay, how well did each of these different groups of kids score? Then what I can do is I can measure you against that. So I can say, okay, you scored as well as let's say you're like a little kid, right? You scored as well as the average sixth grader, and you're 6 years old. That means your mental age is 6, right? You're right on track, basically. Now, again, his goal was to say, do we need to get these extra help to these kids before they get to school? So if that was you, no, you're good, you're right on track. Let's say you score as well as a 9-year-old and you're 6, right? That mental age is now 9. That means you're actually ahead of your average student, right? The rest of the kids that would be in your class. Now, what they really cared about at the time, obviously, was younger kids. Was people who were scoring below. So maybe I'm 6, but I'm scoring the same as most, 4-year-olds. That means I'm quite a bit behind. Now we can intervene, was the goal of this. Now, one thing that's really interesting before we get on to the next one is Benjamin was actually really specific about the fact that he did not believe that what he created was, I don't know if I want to say it was an intelligence test, but that it should be used to measure the ability of people. It was really there to say, okay, where are these students right now, not can they improve or should they do different things than other kids. It was just about this is where they are right this second, and now we're going to move forward. What we end up seeing, though, is exactly what he didn't want to happen ends up happening. So, oops, now I can't move myself again. Hold on, let's see if I can get out of the way of this. Let's go down here. Okay. So, what ends up happening is pretty much exactly what he doesn't want to happen. So he creates this test, he creates this idea of mental age, and we're kind of can then compare kids. Eventually what we see is a psychologist out of Stanford, Louis Terman, creates what's called the Stanford-Binet intelligence test. So you can see Binet is obviously coming from, the Binet intelligence test, and then Stanford is the school that he was working at. So he basically kind of changed the test a little bit. So this is one of the most widely used intelligence tests, and it's basically the American version of Binet's test. Now, one of the things he did that's really important that became super impactful was he created what is called the intelligence quotient, or IQ. So anytime you've ever heard anybody say something about IQ, this is where it's coming from, or this is where it at least began, this intelligence quotient. So what he did, and this has changed a little bit how they do this math, but originally what they did was they found your mental age. That's what the exam gave you. So you took the exam, at the end, the score you got at the end of the exam was your mental age. Then what they did is they divided that by your chronological age. So let's say your mental age is, let's say it's 10, your actual age is 8, right? They divide it by that. And then what they do is they multiply it by 100. So what this does is basically the idea is that if you're scoring the exact same mental age as you are chronological, your IQ is 100. And 100 is perfectly average IQ. It's exactly in the middle, and it's always that. Now, if you score better, if your mental age is higher, right, that IQ number is going to increase. If you score lower, that IQ number is going to decrease. So 100 is perfectly average, right? As we move above 100, it's slightly, you're moving above average. As you move below 100, you're moving below average. And then obviously, ones that are really high, right? So if somehow you got a mental age that was 1.5 times your chronological age, right, you'd have a score of like 150, which is an incredibly high IQ. If you're scoring half as well as your chronological age, you'd have an IQ of 50, which is considered like mentally disabled. So those are kind of like how we can look and measure it. Now, today they do score IQs a little bit different. It's not like this perfect math equation anymore. It's more about a comparison to the average score of your age group. And we'll talk about kind of why they maybe changed this a little bit later. But they've just changed the math a little bit. The general idea is basically the same. Okay, so let's look at our next intelligence test, which is the Weschler Adult Intelligence Scale, or WAIS. There is also another version called the Weschler Child Intelligence Scale, which is WCIS. It comes from the psychologist David Weschler. This is the most widely used intelligence test. Now, at least true intelligence test. I should kind of be specific about that. Obviously, you can go online and find an intelligence test. It's not really the same as doing like a true one. So what the WAIS intelligence test is basically where they take a variety of different tasks, right? There's a whole bunch of different things that you're going to do, both verbal and performance. And then they're going to basically add them together and create this kind of large overall look at all these different characteristics, attributes, abilities of you. So there's actually 15 different subtests. So there's 15 different tests that you'll take that are all different. They're looking at different things. And then what happens is they can basically analyze your scores on all of those. So you get an overall intelligence score, so kind of like an IQ score. You get an overall number. You'll also get individual scores for different things like verbal comprehension, perceptual organization, working memory, processing memory. So it's a really kind of specific test, right? Where we've got this overall, this is how intelligent you are, and then here's all these other little abilities as well, and kind of how you score there. Now again, there's an adult version, there's a child version. This is something though that would have to be done by a psychologist. Like you need to go to somebody who actually, it's their job to give intelligence tests, and they would then apply this to you. This isn't something you take online or as a worksheet or anything like that. So let's talk about how these tests kind of come to be. Because I think this is really important, and this isn't necessarily just these tests that we talked about specifically, but also tests in general, whether they're aptitude or, and now I'm like really blanking on what I was thinking about, achievement or aptitude, whether achievement or aptitude. So the first thing that's really, really important with any kind of test, especially something that we want to measure and compare people to, but especially intelligence tests, is they have to be standardized. What that means is they need to have uniform testing procedures and meaningful scores that we can compare. So this is something where, and this is why like the ACT and your AP tests and your SAT, if you take something like that, or the MCATs and all these other kind of standardized tests are really focused on things like security and really focused on having very strict procedures, right? When you guys take your ACT, there's like very specific things we have to do, right? As a teacher, I have to read word for word the exact same explanation of everything. I have to give you the exact same amount of time down to the minute. I have to give you, the exact same amount of a break. You have, there's all these other things that are very, very specific. And the reason for that is that if those things change, that can affect your scores, right? So if you have one teacher who's being really specific and going into a lot of detail, explaining everything you need to do, and another one that basically just says, well, you guys know what to do, go ahead and get started, right? Those two things might affect how a student performs. And now all of a sudden, we're not able to compare these groups anymore. In addition, there's a ton of work that goes into the front end of these tests of trying to determine how well students are actually doing. So, for example, like our AP psych test, because obviously all these tests change every year. One of the things they have to do ahead of time is they need to come up with questions, right? But obviously how hard or easy those questions are changes all the time, right? Like if you're doing a new question every time, it's not like you can perfectly decide exactly this question is exactly as hard as this question, right? It's going to always be a little variable. So some of the things they have to do ahead of time is basically pre-test groups, right? They have to look at people and say, okay, we know exactly how well you will do. Here's this test. Let's see what you score on it, right? And that tells us, is this test a little bit harder? Is this test a little bit easier? And then we can now apply that, right, overall. And this is why, like, our AP scores, for example, change every single year, where sometimes you need, 120 to get a 5. Sometimes it's 107, right? It's basically just shifting because this test was a little bit harder, this test was a little bit easier, right? And we know kind of basically where that should stand. So there's a lot of work that goes into standardization. The next thing is reliability. Oh, and I should also mention, standardization also means that the test is the same, right? So obviously, if I want to compare like ACTs, or let's say I want to compare intelligence scores to students, everyone has to get the same test. Otherwise, what am I really comparing, right? If one person's test is different than another's, now all of a sudden, well, can I really compare those two anymore? So that becomes really important. We also have what is called reliability. Let's see if I don't know if I can move myself out of the way really this one, at least not as much. I'm just going to go right here. Okay, so talking about reliability as well as validity, which we will talk about in the next slide. So what is reliability? Reliability is basically how consistent our testing results are. Okay, how consistent are they? So if I give you, let's say, an AP Psych test, right? If I give you one test and you get a 60%, and then I give you another test and you get 80%, and I give you another test and you get a 30%, and I give you another test and you get a 90%, right? Something is probably wrong with my test there, right? The chances are it doesn't have to do with you necessarily. Something's probably wrong with the reliability of my test. Basically where it's all over the place, right? There's something wrong with how it's being measured. So what I want is you to see a relatively stable scores, right? So for example, like obviously like students improve and things like that, but generally speaking, right, if I'm giving a test and I see someone get like a 90% on the first 5 tests, right, I'm going to expect that they're going to be relatively similar on the next one, right? If it drops a lot, okay, that tells me either something happened in that with that student or there's something wrong with my test, right? If I see, okay, everyone's getting 80s, right, 80% every single test, and then suddenly everyone gets a 40%, okay, well, something probably happened here, right? That's maybe not a reliable test. So there's a bunch of different ways to do this. One way to do it is they look at the consistency on scores of the 2 halves. So they compare the first half of the test to the second half of the test. Do you basically get the same amount right? Because if the questions are all mixed up, right, if you get 50% on the first side, we expect that you'll get about 50% on the second side. So you should be relatively similar. We can also have alternate forms of the test where there's a bunch of them that kind of look a little bit different. See, do we get similar answers? We can also retest. So if I have you take a test 6 times, do you score relatively similar each time? Those would be the things that point to being reliable, right? So reliability, again, is kind of about, reliability is really about clustering our scores, right? Do we score similar? So if the same person's taking a test over and over again, are they scoring similarly, right? So it would look like this. This is a reliable test. It's not necessarily valid, but it is reliable. Now the next side of this is, or the other side of this is validity. So validity has to do with, does the test measure what we want it to measure? Does it predict whatever we're trying to predict? So how accurate is it? So for example, right, our ACT, we talked about that. The idea is how well does it predict students' performance in college? So what we would do is we'd give a bunch of kids ACT tests, right? We'd keep track of how they did in college, and we would compare. And we would say, okay, you know, if a kid scores really high on the ACT, did they do well in college? If they score low on the ACT, did they struggle in college? Right? And we can compare that, and if it's really good, if it's pretty accurate, we can say it's a valid test. Okay, that it's accurate to it. Same thing with psych, right? If I give you guys a test, I can say, okay, how well does this really show your knowledge of psychology? That's basically my question. Now again, there's 2 different types of validity. There's content validity, which is how well it samples the behavior of what's called of interest, right? So in AP Psych, we're using content validity. That's the question that's what I'm trying to get to. So are you able to show me that you understand psychology? Are you able to define terms? Are you able to use them in FRQs? Are you able to answer those questions in multiple choice? How well does it test a behavior? Predictive validity is more like an ACT. How well does it predict your behavior in the future? So for the ACT, it's trying to predict how well will you do in school. So if it's highly valid, right, that would mean that the ACT is a good predictor of how well you'll do in school. Okay, and that's kind of what we're seeing. So all these standardized tests are trying to narrow in on this, right, where we're trying to get to, right, a test that is valid, right, and reliable. So it's measuring what we want it to measure, and it's doing it in a way that is reliable. It's doing it where we know that it's a good score. Okay, so that's going to wrap up all of our conversation on assessing intelligence. Take some time and write a quick summary for me, and I'll see you guys next time.